So today what we're going to talk about is making the distinction between being worthy of something and being deserving of something, and how just the sort of internal language use or concept use is going to affect some things. And I'm going to make the argument that it is better to, in general, be worthy of something than it is to be deserving of something. Now, both are a sort of way of thinking that it is appropriate for good things to happen to you or to get things that you desire. So they both follow that pattern in terms of their similarities. And I think the primary point of distinction between the two is whose responsibility it is for the actualization of you getting whatever external reward seems appropriate for you to receive. In the case of being worthy, I think the onus is on the individual themselves, and they are the ones who are responsible. In the case of being deserving, the onus of actualization seems to be on society. If you're deserving of something, then society should be giving it to you. And I think that this distinction is an important one. If you're worthy of something, you go out and you get it, you take responsibility. If you're deserving, you have the expectation that you will receive it, which starts to create this distinction is what colors the entire distinction between these two words. When you are trying to be worthy of something, or when you're worthy of something, it's motivating. When you perceive yourself as worthy of something, there's still work to be done, right? It means that you are capable of going out and getting something, but you have to get it. When you see yourself as deserving of something, then you have entitlement and a sort of anger or indignance when you don't receive it. And this is particularly troublesome in cases where it can be outside your control whether or not you receive something. And so when you're worthy of something and you don't receive it and it's outside your control, it's a bit more of a shrug of the shoulders. You have a more stoic response, right? When you feel that you are deserving of something and you don't receive it, there's a chip on your shoulder type of attitude that goes along with it. Which causes it to be, when you're feeling worthy, you're more centered and is more positive for your self-esteem. I think the last video I made talked about self-worth versus self-efficacy, and this is sort of an unpacking of self-worth, the distinction between deserving and worthiness. But what's different about being deserving is, instead of protecting your self-esteem, it sort of undermines it, because you need validation of your being deserving of something, because there's sort of a reverse engineering of what's deserving. In terms of post-hoc analysis, a lot of people, when they get something good, when they're in this deserving rather than worthy mindset, when they get something good, they rationalize backwards that they were deserving of it all along, and so it seems appropriate. Sometimes you just get lucky, right? And so to think you are deserving of something you received when you just received it through luck rather than merit is actually a problematic behavior. So what I think that this sort of thing lends to, the being centered versus being externally validated, is you have what's called an internal locus of control when you are focused on self-worth. And you have an external locus of control when you're focused on deserving something. Which means you're more focused on what others do, and when something goes bad, you're more likely to blame others. So when you don't get what you want, you blame others because you're deserving of it. When you think of yourself as worthy, and some things don't go your way, you're more process-oriented because you have to go out and get it yourself. So you're more likely to look at failure as a sort of feedback. This also goes along with Carol Dweck's sort of distinction between being in a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. People who think of themselves as worthy are more in a growth mindset, and deserving is more of a fixed mindset. And so this is unpacking like the basic ideas, and one of the particular problems I think is that I think that thinking of yourself as deserving when you don't get what you want can create feelings of helplessness because of the external focus of how things are. And so you can start to feel that what you do doesn't matter, and it's just a matter of if society gives you what you deserve or not, which, if you don't think what you do matters, you're more likely to sort of pull your hand out of the sock puppet that is your life, right? And if you do think what you do matters, you're more likely to focus on what you do. And so it creates this sort of thing where, on a secondary level, what's going to happen is that this perspective, either being deserving or worthy, is going to start to filter and color the way you see reality in such a way that if you are striving for worthiness versus deserving, the striving is going to be different. When you are striving towards being worthy, there's a Greek word for excellence, is arete, and I'm pretty sure that's it. And it is this sort of, it's both a craftsmanship type of excellence as well as a moral excellence. And the ancient the Greeks were much more process oriented. And so when you're focused on being worthy, it's less about if you get the thing that you feel that would be appropriate for you to get. Your focus is much less on that thing and much more on your own standards and values, which are the things within your control, right? What you receive in life a lot of times is just outside of your control. So if you're overly focused on that, like you would if you're feeling deserving, the problem is that you're focusing on something that's outside of your control, and there's not much to be done about it. And if you don't get what you want, it's like sourdough grapes. So with being deserving, there's more of a focus on attainment, which isn't really the proper way to get what you want anyways, in terms of if you're focused more on skill building and growth, that's a better way of going about things than being focused on just getting what it is. And so I'm trying to think of the proper way to word it, in terms of, there's a feedback loop, right? Where you are trying to get, the feedback loop of being like the deserving mindset is you are going to backwards rationalize. Whenever you get something good, you're going to backwards rationalize, oh, I deserved it, which is perhaps unhealthy because sometimes you don't, and you're looking more, the logic of how you are rationalizing things looks more at attainment than anything else, right? So if you get something good, you might backwards rationalize, hey, I'm deserving. Or if you fail to get something good, you might rationalize, hey, I'm not deserving, which might be erroneous. It might be appropriate for you to get the thing, but you just happen not to get it, right? But it's the focus on attainment. Whereas a worthy mindset, you're focused on excellence and values, and the feedback loop is when you get a failure or of sorts, it's okay, what did I do wrong? What can I do differently? How does this relate to skill? Am I growing? Those sorts of questions. So the sort of, if we zoom back and think of it back towards what the initial internal versus external responsibility that I mentioned, being internally focused is going to be more psychologically stable and healthy for self-esteem, because you focus on what's within your control and you just try and achieve a sense of worthiness. You try and do what you think a person who, you figure out what you want, and then you figure out what a person who is worthy of those things does, and then you just try and do those things, and you focus on doing those things to the best of your ability. And I think that approach is much better than the deserving mindset, where you figure out what you want, and then you figure out how people get it or who determines who gets it, and then you sort of have to make a pandering argument to them via performance of some kind that you are deserving of the thing, and everything that constitutes not getting the thing is failure. And because you don't have to think of it as failure, you can think of it as part of a feedback process of getting closer and closer. But if you just think of it as failure via like a fixed mindset, it's problematic. Now, there are instances where I think that operating from a deserving mindset is better. And that is in the instance of when someone is mistreating you and in terms of thinking about boundaries. So I think when it's in the negative of, I think it's good to think of things in terms of deserving, because deserving is externally focused, in terms of behavior that is not acceptable from others in terms of how they treat you. So I think it's problematic to think of deserving in terms of receiving positive benefits towards yourself. But I think it's actually pretty good in terms of when you are receiving negative sort of behavior from others that's out of line, saying, hey, I don't deserve that, is appropriate. And the reason why I think it's appropriate is because it allows you to wrap your head around and try and think of behaviors that are going to lead to resolutions or clarifying to others what your boundaries are, and so that they don't step on them. And the primary difference here is, or the thing to keep in mind here is, you are primarily operating from a sense of worthiness. But when it comes to how others are violating your boundaries, thinking about what you deserve is appropriate because the mechanism is better. Because the worthiness mechanism is internally focused, right? So if someone actually is mistreating you, and your approach to that is to sort of just kind of, how should I say, ignore it, that can be problematic, right? Because if you're just like, well, I think someone who would get treated positively would behave like this, and so I'm going to try and behave like that, and I'm just going to focus on that. That's what trying to be worthy gets you, right? But some people are just going to treat you bad, regardless of what you do, and it has nothing to do with you, it has to do with them. So being able to either step away from the relationship or, confront them in such a way that's productive is going to be what you want to do. And so sometimes you need to be externally focused. But if you're externally focused all the time, then you start focusing on attainment rather than your own craft and the pursuit of excellence. So it's about finding a bit of a balance where, and I don't want to assign numbers to it, but everyone loves 80-20. So let's just say 80-20. Perhaps 80% of the time, you're focused on achieving worthiness of what you want. And 20% of the time, you're focused on what you deserve, specifically in terms of if you're being mistreated. So not things that you should have that you don't, like, oh, I deserve a new car, oh, I deserve stuff like that. You don't focus on those types of deserves, but you focus on perhaps if people are mistreating you so that you can better set boundaries. Now, one of the difficulties with these sorts of discussions where we're basically bifurcating a single idea into two other ideas so that we can pinpoint what aspects of it are good and what aspects are bad. One of the difficulties here is it's like fairly nuanced and it's easy to be hard and fast with the language. I'm not suggesting that every time you say deserve, you've committed an error of some kind, or if you use deserve for worthiness, that there's a problem. I'm just offering this as a model for how to think about it in order to sort of focus on the good aspects of believing you're deserving of good things, and also focus on the negative and try and get all the good ones, the worthiness ones, without perhaps getting as much of the deserving ones or the bad ones. Because part of self-esteem is believing that you're worthy of happiness and your desires, right? But no one wants to be an entitled brat, right? And it seems like It's a sort of Aristotelian golden mean thing where you're trying to find the sweet spot in between being overly, let's say, deserving and under worthy would perhaps be one way to think of it, right? You're trying to have a certain level of self-worth, and I think that or not even a certain level, you're trying to have it with the good parts without the bad parts, and I think that sort of separating it into these two ideas conceptually helps for thinking your way through what's good and what's bad in regards to self-worth. So, if you like this video, feel free to give it a like. If you want to see more content, feel free to subscribe. And as far as discussion goes, does anyone have any suggestions or questions in regards to self-esteem, self-worth, deserving, or that sort of thing that they want answered, perhaps in a future video? And have a good one.